They came with chainsaws before sunrise. They didn't knock. They didn't warn her. By the time my mother opened her curtains, half her orchard was already on the ground. Trees she'd planted the year my father died, cut down like they meant nothing, but the HOA didn't know one thing. Buried in a courthouse basement, in a deed older than their entire subdivision, was a single line that would end them. If you love watching entitled HOA boards get exactly what's coming to them, hit subscribe right now because this one gets brutal. My mother is 71 years old. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't make enemies. For 30 years, she's grown apples, pears, and 2 rows of peach trees on the back half of her property, the same land her husband cleared with his own hands before cancer took him in 2003. She never asked the HOA for permission. She never thought she'd need to. Then, 3 months ago, a new board president moved in. A man named Gary Hutchins, early 40s, gated community energy, the kind of man who measures grass height with an actual ruler. Within weeks, letters started arriving, violation notices, fines, something about unauthorized agricultural structures, and unsightly vegetation exceeding community standards. My mother laughed the first time. She thought it was a joke. It wasn't. The fines climbed from $50 to $200 to $1,000 a month. Then came the letter that made her hands shake, a final notice, giving her 14 days to remove the orchard or the HOA would do it for her and bill her for the labor. She called me crying, not because of the money, because of what those trees meant. I told her not to worry. I told her I'd handle it. I didn't know yet that Gary Hutchins had already scheduled the crew. I didn't know he'd shown up that morning with a work order and a smile, standing on her lawn like he owned it. And I definitely didn't know that somewhere in a dusty file cabinet there was a deed from 1961, one nobody on that HOA board had ever bothered to read. A deed that was about to turn their entire case to ash. Because what Gary didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my mother's orchard wasn't just planted on her property, it was protected by it. The morning the chainsaws showed up, my mother was still in her robe. She heard the trucks before she saw them. 2 flatbeds, a wood chipper, and 4 men in orange vests standing at the edge of her property like they were about to demolish a condemned building instead of a garden she'd tended for 3 decades. Gary Hutchins stood in front, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, like he was starring in his own movie. "Ma'am, we have authorization," he said. "You were notified." She hadn't even had coffee yet. She ran outside in her slippers, begging them to stop, waving the fine notice like it might mean something to men who were just doing a job. It didn't. The first chainsaw started before she even reached the fence. She told me later that the sound of that first tree falling, the one her husband planted the week before his diagnosis, was the worst sound she'd ever heard. Worse than the hospital monitors, worse than the funeral bells. By the time I got the call, 4 trees were already gone. I drove there so fast I don't remember half the trip. When I pulled up, Gary was standing near the wreckage, calm as ever, telling my mother this was for the good of the community's aesthetic standards. I almost lost it right there. But instead, I asked him one question. "Do you have a copy of the property's original plat and deed on file?" He blinked. "That's not necessary. HOA covenants supersede." "Do you have it? Yes or no?" He didn't. Of course he didn't. Nobody on that board had ever looked past the HOA's own 1998 bylaws. They assumed the neighborhood's rules applied to every inch of land inside the gates. They were wrong. Because my father, a man who never trusted institutions, who kept every paper he ever signed in a fireproof box in the attic, had shown me something years ago that I'd almost forgotten. A yellow deed from 1961, back when this land was still farmland before any subdivision existed. A deed with a clause that predates the HOA by nearly 40 years. I told the crew to stop cutting. Gary told them to keep going. That's when I pulled out my phone and made the first call that would change everything. Not to a lawyer, not yet. To the county recorder's office. Because if what I remembered was true, that 1961 deed didn't just describe my mother's land. It legally protected it from exactly what was happening in front of us. And Gary Hutchins had just given me all the evidence I needed to bury him. The woman at the county recorder's office almost didn't believe me at first. "You want the original plat map? From 1961? She asked, like I'd requested Moonrock. "Yes, and whatever deed restrictions are tied to it. Today, if possible." She pulled it up in 20 minutes. What she read to me over the phone made me stop breathing for a second. The land my mother's orchard sat on wasn't originally part of the HOA's platted subdivision at all. It had been a separate parcel, a legacy agricultural easement, granted by the county to the original farming family, with a clause stating the land was permanently reserved for agricultural use, exempt from future zoning or association overlay restrictions in perpetuity. In perpetuity, meaning forever, meaning no HOA created decades later could touch it. When the subdivision was built in the 90s, someone had clearly missed this, or worse, buried it. I drove back to my mother's house with the printed documents still warm from the copier, my hands shaking with something between rage and relief. The crew had paused, waiting on Gary, who was pacing near his truck, phone pressed to his ear. By the time I arrived, only 2 more trees had come down. 6 were gone total. But the peach trees, the 2 her husband planted the same week she found out she was pregnant with me, were still standing. I walked up to Gary and held out the papers. "Read this before your guys touch another branch." He skimmed it, and I watched his face change in real time. The confidence drained out of him like air from a punctured tire. This can't be right," he muttered. "Our covenants apply to the entire neighborhood." "Your covenants," I said, "apply to land that was legally part of the subdivision when it was platted. This parcel wasn't. You just spent 3 months finding a 71-year-old widow, and today you destroyed 6 trees on land your HOA never had jurisdiction over." He went quiet. Then he did something that told me everything about the kind of man he was. He smiled, handed the papers back, and said, "We'll let our attorney sort this out." He had no idea. His attorney wasn't going to save him, because what I hadn't told him yet, what I was about to find out myself within the hour, was that this wasn't the first time the HOA had tried this exact move, and there was a paper trail proving it. It took one phone call to a neighbor 3 streets over, a woman named Denise, to crack the whole thing wide open. They tried this with the Alvarez family 2 years ago, she told me. Different reason, said their fence was non-compliant. Same board, same lawyer. Alvarez family didn't fight it. They just paid the fine and moved out 6 months later. 6 months later. Moved out. I asked her if she remembered who bought the Alvarez property after that. She paused. The HOA did, through some kind of trust. Flipped it 8 months later for almost double. My stomach turned. This wasn't about grass height. This wasn't about community aesthetic standards. This was a pattern, target a vulnerable homeowner, bury them in fines and code violations until they cracked, force them out, and profit from the resale. And my 71-year-old mother, alone since my father died, grieving, trusting, non-confrontational, she was the perfect next target. I called a real estate attorney that same afternoon, a sharp woman named Patricia Vance who'd handled HOA disputes for 15 years. I sent her the 1961 deed, the fine notices, and everything Denise had told me about the Alvarez family. Patricia went quiet on the phone for almost 30 seconds after reading it. "This isn't just a deed dispute anymore," she finally said. "If what you're describing is accurate, this could be pattern of conduct harassment, possibly tied to a civil conspiracy claim. And if HOA board members personally profited from a forced sale they orchestrated, that's not a covenant violation." "What is it?" I asked. "That's the kind of thing that ends careers and puts people in depositions they'll never forget." That night, my mother sat at her kitchen table staring at photos of the trees my father had planted, 6 of them gone, stumps still raw, in the moonlight. She asked me quietly if this was even worth fighting. I told her the truth. They picked the wrong widow. 2 days later, Patricia filed for an emergency injunction to stop any further action on the property. The hearing was set for the following week. But the night before that hearing, Gary Hutchins made one phone call that he thought no one would ever trace back to him. He was wrong. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Thursday. At 8:40, Patricia pulled me aside in the courthouse hallway, her face tight with something between excitement and disbelief. "You need to see this," she said, sliding her laptop toward me. It was a call log, subpoenaed overnight from the HOA's management company after Patricia flagged spoliation risk the moment she filed. The night before the hearing, Gary Hutchins had called the HOA's property manager. The call lasted 4 minutes. Right after it ended, someone logged into the HOA's shared drive and deleted a folder labeled Alvarez, Property History. Deleted. The night before a hearing about the exact same pattern of conduct. But here's what Gary didn't know. HOA management companies back up everything to a third-party server for liability reasons. Patricia had already requested those backups 2 days earlier. They had it all. Every email, every internal message where board members joked about getting rid of dead-weight homeowners. Every spreadsheet tracking properties they'd targeted, fined, and eventually acquired through trusts with names like Meadowbrook Holdings, a company registered to Gary Hutchins' brother-in-law. When the judge asked the HOA's attorney to explain the 1961 agricultural easement, he had nothing. When she asked about the deleted folder and the timing of that phone call, he had less than nothing. The judge didn't just grant the injunction. She referred the case to the state attorney general's office for review of potential fraud and unfair business practices. My mother's fines were void, retroactively and permanently. The HOA was ordered to pay for restoration of the destroyed trees, full mature replacements professionally installed at their expense. Gary Hutchins resigned from the board 11 days later. Quietly, no statement, just gone. 6 months after that, 3 other families, including a version of the Alvarez story we never even knew about, came forward with nearly identical complaints. The state's investigation is still ongoing. My mother planted 2 new peach saplings where the old ones used to stand, right next to the 2 that survived. She says the new ones will never replace what was lost. But they're growing. In her soil, on her land, protected now, permanently, by a piece of paper some greedy men should have read before they ever picked up a chainsaw. Some homes are just houses. Hers was never just that. It was proof that sometimes the smallest, oldest, most forgotten piece of paper can outlast every bit of arrogance stacked against it. If this story hit you, hit subscribe, because next week I'm telling you about the HOA that tried to steal a disabled veterans ramp. And trust me, it gets worse before it gets better.